Just 2 days remain before the first deadline arrives in the Conservative leadership race. Candidates who wish to run have to submit a $25,000 fee and 1,000 party members' signatures by this Thursday. So far, 4 people have met those requirements: Marilyn Gladu, Leslyn Lewis, Aaron O'Toole, and Peter MacKay. 8 others have announced their intention to run. There they are there, but they're not official candidates yet on the party's website. Peter MacKay is a Conservative leadership candidate. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. MacKay. Thanks for making time for us.
Hello, Vashi. My pleasure.
Mr. MacKay, you've been urging police in this country to enforce the law when it comes to the protests and blockades that have crippled Canada's rail networks. Yesterday, the OPP did just that at the Tyendinaga rail blockade. But after that move, we've now seen blockades pop up in New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, an additional one in BC. What would you do now?
Well, have the police continue to do their job and respect the rule of law, respect the court injunctions that have been placed now for 2 weeks. And even the Prime Minister, I think, has finally come around to that position. But as you know, Vashi, this is having a detrimental impact everywhere. Thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in losses. One of the things I think that should happen is the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee should be meeting to talk about these solutions, bringing people and experts forward to talk about how we actually move ahead. And of course, the dialogue can continue, but those blockades need to come down urgently, and the police simply have to enforce the rule of law. My
point is, though, is like you said, the police are now enforcing the law, right? They're carrying out these injunctions, and we've witnessed that over the last 24 hours. But rather than that kind of being an end to all of this, we're seeing additional protests pop up elsewhere, traffic impeded in other parts of the country. And I have yet, and it's a question I put to the Liberals all the time, right? So like, what comes next?
Well, as I said, respecting the rule of law, it's very much incumbent upon the police to keep peace and order. And look, it's important, Vashi, that they're doing so in a respectful and measured way. No one is advocating violence. No one is advocating confrontation. But look, like any other crime, and this is a crime, to be impeding and stopping public transportation, preventing goods and services from being delivered across the country. We have propane shortages now in Atlantic Canada and parts of the country. We are seeing critical things such as medicine and food, the inability to move large bulk transportation of grain and other commodities across the country. This is paralyzing the nation, and the government has been lacking in their response. The Prime Minister was out of the country for much of this crisis when it began. So there's an urgency, as I said, if I could finish.
What you said that they should do. Yeah, pardon me.
Well, it took them a long time. That's the point. Justice delayed is justice denied. And for a lot of people, this has had a huge impact. I would expect there are going to be a lot of class actions. And again, that's not for now. The urgency is to get commodities moving. And the urgency is to avoid any further delay in making these passages clear. It has to happen.
One of your competitors in this leadership race, Marilyn Gladu, suggested sending in the Army. Would you support that?
No, I certainly don't. I don't think that's necessary, and we're nowhere near that point. The police have the adequate training, ability, and equipment to do what's required. And I think what you're seeing is, in essence, these copycat protests happening now from professional protesters, not unlike those who are most involved in the disruption now. They're predominantly not from the Indigenous community. These are folks who have another agenda, an eco agenda that wants to somehow hold up and impede natural resource development. And so, sadly, there has been a philosophic opposition to resource development from the government that has in some way fostered this feeling that this type of behavior is okay, and it's not okay.
I want to ask you about that in a second, but
Sure.
First, how do you know that most of these protesters aren't Indigenous? How do you know that they don't have legitimate grievances?
Well, I've heard from Indigenous leaders personally. I've spoken to some of them. I've seen photographs of individuals who were there at the site, which is difficult to discern because many of them are wearing masks and deliberately trying to hide their identity, which again doesn't really speak to the strength of their convictions. And so I take Indigenous leaders at their word. And
Isn't
the reality
it a dangerous
is,
assumption, though?
No, well, if we can go back to basic principles here, who in the Wet'suwet'en community has been supportive of the gas pipeline? You know, the vast majority, the
elected band council.
The entirety of the elected band council, the majority, as I believe, of the hereditary chiefs, and the
Not
vast
the hereditary
majority
chiefs in that area,
and 20 other bands along the route. And so, who is speaking and who is being supportive of the First Nations who have a huge interest in this pipeline happening. So there's a complete skewing and misrepresentation of who these protests are acting for.
By whom, though? And I'm asking genuinely because I've heard what you just said from multiple politicians, actually of multiple party stripes, including the provincial NDP in BC. I think there is a representation that there is obviously a disagreement about this pipeline and the route it should go and how it should be built and when it should be built and all those things. But to just sort of dismiss the people who have grievances about this process as professional protesters, is that a dangerous assumption?
Well, it's not simply a disagreement. This is now action that is crippling the nation's economy. And this is not the way to go about any sort of dialogue. And the dialogue, as I said, can continue both before and after, but those protesters are out breaking the law, impacting on Canadians' daily lives, their ability to move, to go to various locations where they work, having a hugely detrimental impact on our economy, and it has to stop. The police have to enforce the law. If someone was to break the law in many other ways, we know and would expect the police to be there.
They are.
Well, they're not enforcing the law, Vashi, because the protests and the blockades continue to be in place in many parts of the country. So the law is not being enforced. It is freeing people's ability to move and have their goods transported across the country. It's not being enforced.
So are you critical of the police forces who are making those decisions then?
No, as I just said, we need to give them a clear signal and a clear mandate to do their jobs, and that hasn't been coming from Ottawa for some weeks.
What's the difference between a clear mandate and a direction? And should politicians be directing police forces?
Well, no, we don't direct police and we don't direct prosecutors, although the Prime Minister's office is loath to do that. But we do, in very simple words, call on them to do their job. The Prime Minister started to do that 2 weeks late. But now the police, I believe, are starting to move. So, no, I'm not criticizing the police at all. I'm saying we need to give them a clear signal from Ottawa what's wanted by the government.
I want to touch on a point you made a bit earlier, circle back to the idea that you put forth that the policies and things that the government have pursued have created an environment where resource projects like the Coastal GasLink pipeline can't go ahead. You also were critical of the federal government when it came to Tech's decision to pull the plug on the Frontier Mine announced late Sunday night. I want to read a portion of the letter from Tech's CEO Don Lindsay in which he made this announcement. He said, "We support strong actions to enable the transition to a low-carbon future. We are also strong supporters of Canada's action on carbon pricing and other climate policies such as legislated caps for oil sands and emissions." You've said that you won't pursue a carbon tax. Is Tech's CEO wrong?
No, he's suggesting that there is something we all can do, including the oil and gas industry, and they're doing it. They're actually leading. They're world leaders in the way that they are producing oil and gas for Canadians and for export. The problem is that we can't get it to market. And what we've seen with Energy East, what we've seen with other projects, is that they have failed. And with Tech and Tech Frontier project, all of the approvals were made, all of the regulations were met, they were ready to go ahead, and the government again held it up, and now they've chosen to withdraw. We're losing, again, billions of dollars, thousands of jobs as a result. And look, let me answer on the carbon. With respect to the Paris Climate Change Accords, 720 megatons of carbon. And Canada is supposed to, under its current commitments, get down to 510 in the next 10 years. In order to do that, Vashi, let's be clear, about a third of Canadians would have to stop driving. A third of Canadians would have to turn the temperature of their homes down significantly in the spring. And that's not going to happen. And the reason I oppose...
So you're saying the Paris Accord targets will not be met under your leadership?
Well, no, I'm not saying that at all. That's a nice try, Vassy, but that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying there is more that can be done in terms of technical advancements that are being made. I've met a number of entrepreneurs who are doing amazing things with waste to gas and waste to energy transition that's happening. We can expect more for sure from our energy producers themselves. But here's how we make a real difference in the world, Vashi. We export highly regulated, competitively priced oil and gas to places like India, Pakistan, China, parts of Europe who are burning coal, because Canadian oil and gas can reduce by 50% coal-fired generation in many of those other jurisdictions. By the way, we shouldn't be importing oil and gas into our own country.
I have to challenge...
Places like Atlantic Canada can get off coal and be on clean natural gas if we can get the energy to them.
I take your point on LNG, but I have to challenge you here because there is no system in place on the exporting of LNG, which then supplants a different source in China. It's not like Canada at this point. The framework doesn't exist, and there are lots of people talking about it, but it doesn't work that way yet, where all of a sudden we get credit for that.
Well, it should, and we should be working hard to renegotiate, because the reality is we're at 1.6% of global emissions, which is minuscule. And with our
But is that
carbon
just an
sink,
excuse to do less?
But can I just finish? With our carbon sink, with our low manufacturing footprint, and it's getting lower by the day with this government's tutelage of how we develop natural resources, yes, we can absolutely make the case for Canada being a source for helping to lower greenhouse gas emissions globally. Isn't that a much more visionary plan? Isn't that a plan that's better than just a tax? Because that's what we have right now. It's not a plan, Vashi. It's a tax.
But
it's
actually,
a liberal
the Liberals
tax
talk
on
about this
people.
too. The Liberals are advocates of exactly what you're saying. They're just saying, in addition, Canada has to do what it can to reduce its own footprint.
Yeah, but they're advocating for it. They're not doing it. And we're seeing oil and gas projects being denied or stalled or turned down to the point where we're not able to move forward. It's also ripping the country apart. It's tearing at the fabric. We're seeing Western alienation. We're seeing anger directed from one sector to another. This has been extremely divisive for our country, and national unity is now back in play.
Don't conservatives bear some responsibility for that, the kind of rhetoric they employ too, just as much as the federal government does?
Well, let's get back to dealing with facts, and let's get back to trying to approve natural resource products that are going to improve our economy, our standing in the world, our ability to contribute to global greenhouse gas reduction. That's what we should all be talking about. And yes, we absolutely need to park the rhetoric and get back to realistic plans that we can do to improve our own economy and those of other developing nations.
Will you park the rhetoric as a candidate for the leadership of the party? Because I can tell you, I interviewed a lot of conservatives on the show yesterday and a lot of liberals, and nobody parked the rhetoric on this issue.
Well, I'm certainly trying, and I hope that you and others will do the same.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. MacKay. I appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you, Vashi. It's a pleasure.